Hi, my name is Zaak Kerstetter. Welcome to another KMG video series where every week we take a look at a different aspect of producing music with Ableton Live. And today I want to talk about one of the most frustrating experiences when making music, which is mixing snares. I get a lot of questions about this. I end up talking about this quite a bit with not only my students, but also people that I work with in the music industry. Because snares, if the snare doesn't work, the whole song falls apart, in my opinion, in a lot of cases, especially in electronic music and dance music. So I want to take a little bit look at not everything to do with mixing snares, because there's a lot of stuff you can do, but I want to look specifically at snares and reverbs, because those two things go hand in hand. And if you can dial in your reverb just right, it can really help the snare sound good, sound nice and full, but also like not be too abrasive. So why do snares and reverbs go hand in hand with each other? The main reason is that, or let's talk first about reverbs. Reverbs are essentially the illusion of space. They create the idea of sound bouncing around within a space, right? So a snare by itself is, number one, it's a very loud instrument, right? You don't sit next to a snare and play it really softly. You hit it as hard as you can, and so it creates this very loud sound, which means it echoes through the space that it exists in no matter what. In addition, snares have a very wide frequency range. They got a little bit of lows, they got a lot of mids and a lot of highs. So as they bounce through a space, they pick up a lot of that sonic area of the space that they live in. So if you have a snare like this that doesn't have any reverb, it sounds a little out of place. Like it's not normal to how we experience a snare that exists in the real world, because when you're producing music inside your computer, you're inside a vacuum, right? There's no space, it doesn't gain a spatial element until it leaves the speakers. So what we want to do is we want to use a little bit of reverb to help kind of dial in our snare a little bit. And I want to look at first a big concept when it comes to working with effects, which is an insert effect versus a return effect. Right, so we have our return effects over here. We have our reverb and our delay versus an insert effect, which means we just put the effect on the track. And we're going to use this as an example just to kind of see what this is going to sound like. We're going to take the reverb and we're going to toss it on here. And this will work. This will give that snare the illusion of space. However, if I want to bump up the reverb a little bit more, we have our dry wet control here. So if I start turning this up, we get more reverb. But check out what happens to the volume of our snare. As we go way up here, it sounds really far away, and we lose a lot of the punch and we lose a lot of the impact of our snare, right? Doesn't sound good. So if you are going to be using a reverb as an insert effect on a snare specifically, keep your dry wet really low, although I wouldn't really recommend it. I would keep it like 20 to 30%. Around there, and then tweak your settings. Although honestly, the better option really is going to not use it as an insert effect, but instead use it as a return effect. And so to do that, we're going to go over to our send knobs. Send A goes with return A, and send B goes with return B. They default to being a reverb and a delay. However, you can make them whatever you want. You can put any combination effects that you want on here. You can add more of them. It's totally up to you. But for right now, we're just going to be using send A to send to our reverb. So we'll play that snare again. And we're going to start turning this up. And it's going to sound a little different, right? So the main difference here is we're using our send knob like a dry wet. And in this situation, our dry wet is already at 100%, which is what we want if we're going to be using a return effect. And before, when we had an insert effect, we had our dry signal here and a wet signal here. And so as the wet signal goes up, the dry signal automatically goes down. It's kind of like a seesaw. Whereas if I have a send knob to control the amount of my reverb, I have my dry signal here, and my wet signal just kind of goes up and down wherever I need it. So I don't lose any volume, I don't lose any impact, I don't lose any transient on my drums, but I gain the reverb, I gain the spatial element, which is what I'm looking for. So we're going to be using this like a dry wet knob to really dial in and get the right amount of reverb. So this is obviously way too much. But I'm going to keep it up here just for the sake of this example, and then we'll turn it down as we get closer to finishing this up. So we'll take a look at the default reverb here. Honestly, I'm going to recommend you don't keep the default reverb settings here. They're not my favorite. They sound a little, I don't know, they don't really sound quite right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this reverb, and I'm going to start from scratch using just the generic default device. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our dry wet, turn it up to 100%. because once again, we're going to be using our send knob like a dry wet. And so if my dry wet is at 50%, half of the signal that I'm sending to my return track is going to be just the dry signal. We already have control of the dry signal with our volume here, so we don't need that. So dry wet stays at 100%. And then let's take a look at some of the settings here. First off, the quality control here, I like to set this as high. It's pretty hard to notice the difference between these, and any higher quality settings will require more CPU from your computer. But honestly, it's pretty light on CPU anyways, and so I will usually just keep this set to high. On top of that, if we want to, we could maybe cut out some of the low frequencies. We don't want like reverb on our lows, so we can dial that down a little bit here. I could take off some of the highs, but honestly, I'm just going to leave it the way it is. And if I need to, I can EQ it later on. The pre-delay is going to act like a little delay before the actual echo or the tail of our reverb. I usually like to set this around 10 to 15 milliseconds for snare drums. You may get different mileage depending on how you like to set it. It's totally up to you. If you turn it up really high, you'll actually hear it as a delay, but it's so fast that you're not really going to notice it a huge amount. And then the decay time is probably going to be the single most important control here that we're going to need to look at. It's going to be how long it's going to tail or echo out. So if I turn this way up, you get this like super huge long echo, which is like, if we're doing dub music, could be great. But for most music, I've found, at least most electronic music, anywhere from like 600 milliseconds up to about 1.2 seconds is kind of the sweet spot I found. Don't take my word for it. It may vary a little bit depending on your style of music, what you like to do, your own personal preferences. But I wouldn't go above 1.5 seconds unless you're like really going for it. So that would be about 1.5. And if I go, say, below 600 milliseconds, say I go to like 500, it's a little too subtle. You don't really get a chance to hear it. So we'll keep about a second for right now. So 600 to about 1.2, give or take a little bit, I think is a good starting point for a snare drum, but there's a little bit of play there. On top of that, the size control can be really interesting. If you turn the size down, your snare is going to sound much kind of like closer and fuller and up front, whereas if I turn this up, the reverb is going to sound a little farther away. So you can play around with that. Stereo, this will keep it in stereo. If you want it to be more in mono, you can turn this down, or you want to spread it out, you can turn it up. I usually just leave this at 100. And then the shape control can also be an interesting thing to play around with. But it tends to be pretty subtle in terms of how it's going to change the texture of your sound. If you want to, you can put a little bit of spin or a little bit of chorus on it. These are both kind of similar controls. This is going to add a little bit of modulation to our early reflections, which is our initial delay. And this is going to add a little bit of chorus specifically to our decay time. But in this situation, I'm not really going to use either of those. So that's going to be kind of my basic starting point for getting my snare drum dialed in a little bit, as far as using the default live reverb. However, in addition, if I want a little bit more EQing, I am highly likely to use something like an EQ8 afterwards. And that way, if I want to cut out some more of the lows, or maybe shelf it off, or maybe tone down the highs a little bit, I could do some of that toning in here, but I feel like I have more control here and I'm just more used to EQing with EQ8. Plus I get the nice spectrum analyzer so I can really kind of see where things are at and what needs a little bit of work and what doesn't. On top of that, I found that a lot of times the volume from my return tracks can be a little bit quiet. So I might also toss a tiny bit of compression on it. Not a whole lot, just a little bit to beef it up a tiny bit. As well as maybe control things like output here, or I can also control output there. I can also control the amount with my dry wet here from my send knob. So that might be a good kind of starting point for playing around with reverb specifically for my snare. Right now, this snare drum is inside a drum rack. So if I were to say play a kick drum or any of those sounds, those also get the reverb on it. I usually don't want reverb on my entire drum set. I might want like a hair of reverb on it. But in a lot of cases, because I'm so picky about my snare, I have just a single dedicated reverb on a return track just for my snare drum. So if that's the situation you're in, I made a video about drum racks a little while ago. You can check out for more in-depth about this, but I can take, say, my snare. If find my snare right here. I can right click and hit extract chains, and it's going to create an entirely new drum rack for me, and that way I can control the send knob individually just for that snare drum and not to worry about like keeping all of the settings on all the rest of my drums okay for my reverb there. In addition, the live reverb here is great if you were looking for another way to really kind of expand upon your reverb settings for, in this case, snares. The Convolution reverb is excellent and has a lot of really great settings in here. And I think in general, you get a little bit more mileage out of the Convolution reverb in terms of diversity of sounds and different kinds of sounds you're trying to get out of a snare drum in particular. I would recommend staying away from some of these super huge spaces. A lot of these spaces in the Convolution reverb are really, really massive. Maybe check out the Made for Drums folder and try some of those out. But the decay time on these defaults to being very, very large. So we're gonna have a 5-second decay time. So when I play, oops, that's very loud. It's gonna be pretty echoey, but we can tone down the decay time here to get the right amount. And turn our drive up all the way. And customize it that way. So if you own the Suite version of Ableton Live, you already own the Convolution reverb. It's a great max value device. I highly recommend checking this out if you're looking to step up your reverb game. But if you don't own Suite, you can actually get quite a bit out of just the regular live reverb, specifically by playing around with controls like the size, the decay time, keep your drive at 100%, and using your send knob to customize the amount of reverb you're getting. And then toss on an EQ8 if you need it, compressor if you need it. If you want to toss more effects on there if you want to, go for it. Sky's the limit, have some fun with it. Just know that when you're using a return effect as opposed to an insert effect, you have a bit more control over the amount of the volume. And in this case with drums, controlling those transients and making sure they sound nice and clear and full, while also having your reverb kind of exist in a separate place where you can customize it and dial in the reverb to be just right. So there's not gonna be a one-size-fits-all for reverbs and customizing them for your snare drums, but hopefully that gives you a pretty good place to get started. So that way when you're mixing your drums, your life becomes a little bit easier. I know that my snare drums have started to sound a lot better once I created a dedicated return track just for snare drums, or claps or snaps or whatever kind of sound I'm using. And just that one sound goes in there, and now I can dial it in to perfection and not have to worry about having one reverb that's gonna control not only my snare, but also all of my other drums at the same time. It's a lot, it's doable, but it's a lot of work and can be a lot of headache. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully you enjoyed watching that, and keep an eye out for more videos come from KMG real soon.